All right, cool. Let's get on to part 2. Okay, so fourth commandment, part 2. We already went over the verse last time, but I'll read it again. This is Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Okay, so I said last week that remember the Sabbath, this command, we're told to remember it, that it consisted of 2 parts. What were those 2 parts?
Oh.
Yes?
Are you saying like each... Wait, what was the question? I'm sorry.
Remember the Sabbath means 2 things. We talked about one of them last week.
Oh, the 2 aspects?
The 2 aspects, yes. There's 2 things that we do on the Sabbath, yes?
Resting and worship.
Resting and worship, right? Rest and worship. That's what remember the Sabbath means. It means you rest and you worship. Last lesson we talked about the worship aspect, right? We focused on why do we worship on Sunday? Where is that rooted in the Old Covenant and the New Covenant? Why does that benefit us? We looked over some objections people bring up to the Sabbath. So today we're looking more on the resting portion, which is where people have a lot more questions and concerns in regards to the fourth commandment. But the great thing about this is that this means the fourth commandment has 2 aspects of it. It means it serves as a transition between the first and second table, right? We said the first table was about what?
Oh.
Yes?
Is it our relationship with God?
Yes. First table is about our relationship with God, and the second table is about what? Josh.
Relationship with other humans.
Yeah. Love God and love your neighbor. Those are the 2 tables. And the fourth commandment belongs to the first table. But the fact that it has these 2 aspects, it shows that there's a transition point here, right? The worship has to do with our relationship with God. Obviously, our relationship with God is one of worship. But now the resting is where now the commandments are starting to shift towards how do we act towards our neighbor, and rest is a big part of that. But we see the command to rest. What does that mean? What does it mean to rest? Just throw out answers. Yes?
Take a break from work.
To take a break from work? Okay. Aubrey.
Using energy, stop using it.
Yeah, it's a very scientific definition of rest, right? Ryan?
Take a break from your job, you still do things that you still enjoy. Like get your...
Yeah, so you're taking a break from like normal paid or normal work, you would say. Okay, right? Anyone else? Definitions of rest? Yes?
Like putting down your cards or relaxing.
Okay, relaxing, right? Yes? Sleep, right? That's like the chief rest that we can have. Yeah, okay. So the commandment simply states that us and those in our household should not work, right? So 6 days you work, the 7th you don't work, okay? But how far should we take this? What qualifies as work, okay? This was a question, you brought up the scientific definition of rest, which is that, energy is not getting expended. So does that mean God wants no energy expended on the Sabbath at all? Clearly not, because even if you're laying in bed, you're expending energy because your lungs are breathing, your heart's pumping, your brain's doing stuff, right? That's still energy being expended. So it clearly can't be that particular in use of work. But what qualifies as work? Okay, and this was a question the Pharisees tried to answer through a bunch of intense restrictive laws that forbade people from doing things on the Sabbath. Things like you could only take a certain number of steps on the Sabbath. I heard one say that if you spit on the ground and it rolled, that would count it as work for some reason. I don't know how it would roll, unless you're hawking up something like
Would it be
chunky,
like every bowl you get 1 step in?
I don't know. But
It counts as 2 steps.
so some of these laws even forbade people from helping those in immediate and dire need. And Jesus talks about this in Matthew 12, 10 through 12. I'll bring it up here. But his point here is that rest does not mean do as little as possible. Does anyone want to read this? Luke.
And a man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So that they might accuse him. He said to them, "Which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath."
Okay, good. So this is one example of many in the Gospels where Jesus heals on the Sabbath or confronts the Pharisees about doing stuff on the Sabbath, right? I'm reading through Luke right now, and it's like, feels like every other chapter something like this is happening. So Jesus is doing this purposefully in order to confront the Pharisees about their abuse of the Sabbath. So Jesus is not opposing the Sabbath laws of the Old Testament. Let's get that clear, okay? Jesus is not opposing any of the Sabbath laws. He's not even opposing the law that says if you genuinely work on the Sabbath, you deserve to be put to death. He's not even opposing that, okay? Because God doesn't contradict himself. What he's doing is he's wiping away all the extra traditions that have been placed on the Sabbath by the Pharisees, okay? The Sabbath was held in very high regard by God, okay? But that should not be taken to mean that God placed an unreasonable commandment on the Israelites. If there was a dire need on the Sabbath, they were allowed to work to fulfill that need. And so that's what Jesus says in the last sentence here. He says, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. If something good needs to be done, and it can only be done on the Sabbath for various reasons, then do it, right? Otherwise, that's evil. You're harming someone either directly or indirectly because you're failing to do good on the Sabbath. Okay? And Jesus calls out that hypocrisy by pointing out that the Pharisees had no problem saving their animal. If their animal is in danger on the Sabbath, they will pull it out of a pit, right? But they'll chide Jesus for healing a man with a withered hand, even though he's actually doing less work than they are just from a physical standpoint, right? Because further on in the passage, he just tells him to take his hand out of his cloak. He just says, show me your hand, and the hand's healed. Jesus didn't touch him, barely looked at him, and he was healed, right? So Jesus declares that it's lawful to do what might be called works of necessity or works of mercy on the Sabbath, right? Now, one important way we could apply this today is questions of people like policemen or nurses or firemen or et cetera, that have to work on Sundays on occasion, right? Yeah, they are tasked with working on the Sabbath, very many of them, right? Firemen, you still need to be able to put out fires. Policemen still need to be able to prevent crimes. Nurses still need to be able to tend to people, right? Which means they're going to have to work on Sunday, okay? So yes, they're working on Sunday, but they're doing a task that is essential for the community. So the same thing would go for all the basic works we have to do just to make it through the day. Things like cook food or maybe change a flat tire if you need to, right? Those are all things that you're allowed to do on Sunday, on the Lord's Day. Why? Because they're necessary, right? God is not unreasonable. God's not being like just pedantic with his laws, right? He takes into account reality. Right? You could think of when the Pharisees confront Jesus about divorce, and Jesus says, well, God hates divorce. And then they're like, well, then why did Moses give us laws? And he said, well, basically because there are some situations where it's called for. So God's willing to I don't want to say meet us halfway, but make understandable laws that aren't totally out of the realm of physical possibility for us to do. Now, it's impossible for us to obey them perfectly, yes, but that's because we're sinners, not because it's actually physically or mentally impossible. So we just want to set this at the start. Rest does not mean do as little as possible, okay? You are allowed to do works. I mean, first off, we come and worship, which isn't necessarily a work, but it is something we're to do. And we can do the works that we need to do just each and every day, okay? The basic works that we have to do to survive. So continuing on, if it doesn't mean we just lie in bed all day, what does that mean? What does it mean to rest? What does that mean for what counts as work? Where's that line? Well, this is what Nehemiah had to deal with back in his day. Does anyone want to read this passage from Nehemiah? Esley.
In those days I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and living them on donkeys. Also buying grapes, figs, alcohol, goods, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day.
All right. So Nehemiah, if you ever read the book or if you're familiar with it, he's just come in. Him and Ezra have done so much work trying to reform the former exiles of Judah that have just come back to the land, right? They're trying to get this country up and running again. They've gone through so much work trying to purify the people again, right? Trying to make them a holy people. And Nehemiah thinks, okay, I've done it. We're here. Now we can rest. And then he goes out on the Sabbath and he sees people doing stuff like this, right? They're treading wine presses. They're bringing in heaps of grain, right? What are they doing?
Working.
They're working, but what kind of work are they doing?
Work that is important.
What was that? Profitable work, right? Work for their own gain, work for money, right? Now, obviously, there's nothing wrong with that if it were done one of the other days of the week, okay? These people are not doing works of absolute necessity where if they don't buy or sell on the Sabbath, they're going to be harmed, right? They're doing it to try and increase their profits, even just a tiny bit. So, in other words, they're doing work for their own gain. The rest of the week, this is perfectly fine, right? Because this work is essential for providing for yourself and for your household. So you should do all this those days of the week. But you don't need to be on the grind 7 days a week, despite what alpha male influencers tell you. You don't need to grind in your sleep, like the doctor says. I know. Anyway, so the Sabbath is supposed to be sort of a bulwark against that, right? It's a bulwark against this kind of like workaholic mindset of I've got to keep going. And yeah, that alone won't eliminate the desire for greed. You can be greedy 6 days out of 7, okay? But it's at least going to like curtail it a little bit and force you to take 1 day off. Oh, there was more. Okay. Esley, read the other verse that I forgot to bring up.
Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day?
Okay, that didn't really add anything, but... Well, actually, no, it does add something, because it means even the nobles of Judah were in on this, right? They didn't care. They're supposed to be the ones guarding the Sabbath and keeping the people faithful to the law, and yet they're breaking it. So, working for your own gain, right? Doing things to gain money, that should generally be avoided on the Sabbath, okay? But even beyond this, work should not be intentionally delayed until the Sabbath, okay? This goes beyond work that just makes us money, okay? We should try to be vigilant in getting all our labors done before Sunday, okay? This means like trying to get your homework done so that you don't have to do it on Sunday, okay? Or certain other things, right? Now, it's one thing if Sunday is literally the only day you can do a certain task. Like I remember back during the summer, I think it was the Sunday before we left for the youth retreat, I had a quiz I had to do. It opened on Sunday and was going to close some other time. I didn't want to take it during the youth retreat, so I took it on Sunday because that was the one day I could take it. But if it was earlier, if it was like Saturday or something, I would have taken it then, okay? So it's one thing if that's your circumstance, if Sunday's literally the only day you can do it. But it's another thing to purposefully procrastinate until the Lord's Day and say, I'm going to wait, slack off, and I got to do it Sunday. Plus, that's the day before you go back to school or whatever. And so that's typically the day if you procrastinate, it's going to end up having to be done on Sunday. So like I said, this means trying to get all your homework done, your chores, a good number of errands done before Sunday. I mean, this is why it's good that most people have Saturdays off too, right? It gives them time to do other stuff. And I'm trying not to be super legalistic with this, because like I said, I understand there are situations sometimes that call for this. But I'll just tell you from personal experience, once you start trying to do this, right? Once you start saying, I'm going to try to get all my work done before Sunday, it makes Sunday a lot more enjoyable. And it allows you to be more responsible with your time. Because even though it's like, oh, it's only one day, yeah, but if you procrastinate, if you're used to doing that, you'll be surprised how much it forces you to kind of get on the ball a little bit. So don't intentionally delay work until Sunday. And as a good example of that, the fourth commandment, it forbids greed and laziness. And I'm going to show you this through this passage in Exodus. Who wants to read this? Aubrey?
On the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found them. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath, therefore on the sixth day he gives you bread for 2 days.
All right. Does anyone know the background of where this verse got pulled out from? Okay. What's been going on so far? Yes? Yeah. So they're in the wilderness. They just got passed through the Red Sea and all that. And the Israelites are saying, we're hungry. You know, they're in the desert. It's understandable. So God sends them bread or manna from heaven. And he says, I'm going to send it out each morning. You're going to go out and gather what you need, what you and your household need for that day, and only for that day, and bring it in and eat it, and then do that every single day. Yes? There we go. That's what we're going to get to, right? There was one exception to this, and that was on the sixth day, you were supposed to go out and get double, because on the Sabbath, which back then was Saturday, there wasn't going to be any gathering on that day, right? So that was the one day you could gather double, but it's only because you weren't going to be gathering the next day, okay? So those are the rules God lays out. By the way, this is before the 10 Commandments are given, which shows that the Sabbath was already in practice before then. Okay, so again, it wasn't just an old covenant thing. But some people, as this verse says, they still tried to go out and gather on the Sabbath day. Now, there's two reasons why someone would do this. Can anyone think of what they would be? Yes?
They were greedy and they wanted more.
Yeah, so that's one, is that they already had enough. They'd already gotten enough on the sixth day, but they just wanted more. There's another reason.
They didn't fully trust that God was going to provide.
Well, maybe in a sense, but there's a more simpler one, yes?
They didn't collect the stuff on Saturday for Sunday.
Yeah, they were lazy. They didn't get as much as they needed on Friday, and now they're like, oh, I'm hungry. I'm going to go out and get more food, and there's nothing there, right? So again, this shows how the fourth commandment addresses both of these seemingly opposite sins, right? You have greed on one side. It says, I need to have more and more and more. I got to have more than my neighbor. I got to have more than my friend, right? That's the people who went out, who already had enough bread and said, I'm going to get more. By the way, do you know what happened to the bread if they kept it longer than they needed to?
Dust in there?
There would be worms and mold and dust in it, yeah, right? That's what would happen. Because God said, just gather enough for what you need. So that's the greedy side. It says, I'm just going to get more. I'm going to have more, right? And so I'm going to work when everyone else is off, right? And then there's the lazy side, which says, oh, I can get it done. I can get it done on the Sabbath, right? I can get it done on the seventh day. And it's like, no, it's not there, right? It's incredible, really, that we as humans are so ready to complain about how burdensome life is, yet when God sets aside a whole day for us to set that burden aside, we say, no, I don't want to, right? We get one whole day, right? Especially in the ancient world, that was good. That was like, kings barely got a day off, right? Everyone was working all the time. But for Israel, God said, you're going to take a day off, right? You're going to take a day off from work. And you look at whenever Israel turned their backs from God, one of the first things to go is they stop resting on the Sabbath, right? The one thing that's supposed to be this time of rest and relaxation, they give it up because they think these false gods will give them better rest and better relaxation, even though they're just making them work more. Okay, so it's very hypocritical for us often to constantly say, oh, I'm so busy, oh, life's just, so much of a heavy burden, which it is, but then we ignore the day that we can set that burden aside. We ignore that day. And then we wonder why we're so stressed out all the time. It's because we're ignoring God's law. We're ignoring the good thing he's given us, right? There's a verse, I didn't put it in here, but Jesus says it. He says, the Sabbath was, man was not made for the Sabbath was made for man, okay? It wasn't as though God made the Sabbath and said, okay, man, I'm going to make you to fit inside this thing. No, this thing was made for us. It's made to benefit us. It's a gift to all mankind. So there is one aspect of the fourth commandment I want to look at, and that has to do with leadership, okay? One of the interesting things about this commandment is that it is aimed at everyone, but it specifically addresses heads of households. Okay? Verse 10 says, on it, you shall not do any work, you or your son, daughter, male or female servant, livestock, or even sojourner. Okay? So he's talking to the person who is the head of household, which in vast majority of cases would be the husband or father, right? Why do you think that is? Why is this commandment aimed at heads of households?
I'm not quite sure, but back in the day, families sort of just owned anything in the house, including all these leaders, and they had like, I wouldn't say ownership, but they kind of give responsibility for the women and the children, and so if they do something, they would most likely always follow it.
Yep. Yeah. Anyone else?
I was going to say being responsible for the house.
They were responsible for their house, right? Yeah. So the heads of household are specifically targeted with this commandment because, one, it would be wrong for a leader to get rest while his inferiors, those under him, don't get rest, right? We all kind of recognize this. So that's one reason. And then two, the head of the household in particular, not just any leader, but especially the head of a household, the head of a family, they are responsible for the spiritual health of the wife and children and even anyone else living under his roof, which would have included slaves at the time or just people that were staying with them. Okay, they were responsible for their spiritual well-being. And part of the spiritual care is bringing them to church or bringing them to synagogue back then to worship God on the Sabbath. Okay, so they're resting so that way this head of household can say, hey, we're going to church. We're going to go worship God. We're going to hear the teaching of the Word of God. We're going to go fellowship with other Christians, right? So that's one reason why it's aimed at the head of household, because they're to include the family in the rest, but also in the worship, okay? But broadening out from just heads of households, right? Even just looking at leaders in general, this means that leaders are obligated to give rest to those under them, okay? Leaders in general should take note of this command. This means that employers are not to work their employees 7 days a week. I mean, we have laws about that in this country. But even those laws are derived out of this principle, right? This principle of the Sabbath. I mean, if you ever hear about someone taking a sabbatical, which usually means like a break from work for a week or two, the word sabbatical is derived from Sabbath, right? So this is a fleshed out part, this is something that's very ingrained in our culture, right? So we see this with employers, right? If some of you are employers one day, maybe you'll be business owners, right? Maybe you'll be something like that. Try to give your employees Sunday off. I mean, not half of you, but a lot of you work at Chick-fil-A, you already get that. And even if they're not believers, even your coworkers who aren't Christians, I'm sure they like having the Sunday off, right? Even they benefit from that, okay? And especially with employees, it's important to not work them 7 days a week because that can lead to burnout, which leads to very poor work performance, which can even in some cases lead to death or suicide, right? In Japan, where this is a very, very big issue, or it's a growing issue, I should say, I don't want to overblow it, but they actually have words for this. They have the word karoshi, which means death by overwork, which means you're so overworked that your body just dies, right? Like you're done with work, you just sit down on a bench and you die. There's karoshi, and then there's karoji satsu, which means overwork suicide, which means you're overworked so much to the point where you kill yourself.
That's gonna be me.
And this, I certainly hope not, right? I certainly hope not. And especially in Japan, because that culture has not been widely influenced by Christianity. They don't really have a deep concept of the Sabbath, right? And I was doing research on this part, and I found a video or an article where someone was saying, according to my company, I'm allowed to take like up to 20 days off from work, right? I'm allowed 20 days of vacation. It has nothing to do with policy. It has to do with the culture. The culture of fear that is present in a lot of Japanese corporations is that if I take a day off when other people don't, my boss is going to think I'm lazier, I'm not as hardworking, I'm going to be passed up for promotions, right? And so on and so forth, right? So it's this culture of fear of not wanting to be seen as lazy just for taking like one day off or even like a half day off to do something with your kid, right? That's a big problem, especially in cultures like that. And it's led to people either dying from overwork or killing themselves. Yes?
What I was also thinking about was that, kind of goes back, but like, if you're a leader, you also want to be the last person to get the rest.
Right.
Because you want to make sure that everybody else gets rest and that they're actually like satisfied with that until then you can be satisfied that day.
Right. Right, exactly. Right. So this is the reason why burnout and overworking has become a big talking point in business circles. I mean, I'm going through business school, like you hear about this every now and then. It's like worker burnout. How can we fix worker burnout? And some do take it too far. That's pretty clear. Some take it really far, demanding like crazy amounts of paid time off, crazy amounts of, all these other benefits that, they don't really deserve or need. So despite that, burnout is an issue. Burnout is a problem. And today people can say, well, we're not working in the fields all day, right? We're not doing as much manual labor. And that's true. But work follows you home today, right? Work is on your laptop. It's on your phone. It's on your computer, right? People are always working now, even on their days off, even when they're on vacation. So while your body may be resting, your mind is constantly at work, and that still affects you, right? That still affects you. We're made to work, but we are not made to work constantly, okay? And this provides us a good way of showing how good God's law is, because there's plenty of unbelievers out there who will, raise a big ruckus about, the sweatshops in China or India that are having children or people work there for like dirt wages compared to what we get here. And it's like, and they're saying that's a problem. It's like, yeah, I think that is a problem. That's basically slave labor, considering what you're paying them. But why is that wrong? Why do you, as an unbeliever, believe that's wrong? Why is it wrong for them to work, days and days and days and days and days on end? It's like this is why, because they're actually assuming the fourth commandment. They're assuming that time off and rest is a moral good, is something that people need. And they're correct, but according to their worldview, they can't explain that. The Christian worldview can. So even unbelievers benefit from the Sabbath rest. And it's true. Like a lot of people say, well, the fourth commandment or even the 10 commandments as a whole, they really just apply to Christians, which isn't true. No one can murder, no one can commit adultery, no one can steal. That's still wrong for everyone. But all of the moral laws written on our hearts, that includes the fourth commandment, right? The Sabbath is written on our hearts. Okay, this is why the fourth commandment says that even the sojourner, the guy that's temporarily staying in your house, who's not an Israelite, right, who's not circumcised, likely, who hasn't taken any oath of allegiance to God, right, even he is entitled to rest. Okay, so even unbelievers benefit from the Sabbath rest. They benefit from it. They may choose to go and do evil with it. Okay, well, that's their prerogative, but they benefit from that rest. Right? People can bring up studies about, how often the human body needs rest. And that's true. And that is God's law being worked out through nature, being worked out in our bodies, that we naturally crave a certain amount of rest. And we talked last time about how Sabbath was established at creation, which means it's a gift God gave to all people. Just like marriage, right? Unbelievers benefit from marriage, even if they're not Christians, even if they don't have the Christian view of marriage. And the same goes for the Sabbath. They should worship God on the Sabbath, of course, but even just taking the day off, or even just by taking the day off from work, they're enjoying God's grace. Okay? So we'll talk more about leadership next week, or the next 2 lessons, I should say, when we go over the 5th commandment, because we're going to talk a lot about leadership and hierarchy and all that. But this is a little teaser for that. Keep this in mind as you guys get older. And even some of you have a level of leadership in your life already. I mean, those of you in trail life, there's like hierarchy in trail life, I imagine. You're in charge of someone to some degree, right? How do you treat them? Just something to think about for next week when we get into that more. All right, so broadening out, let's dig a little deeper into the idea of rest in Scripture beyond what we just see in the 4th commandment. Okay, the 4th commandment talks about resting from physical work. But is there a spiritual significance to rest beyond just not working so you can worship God? There is. Okay, rest is what is offered to us in the gospel. Does anyone want to read this passage from Matthew 11? Yes?
Come to you all who labor and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for yourselves, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
All right. So Jesus sends this call out to all who labor and are heavy laden. Who are these people? Who is he talking to? Well, everybody to an extent, yes. But how is he describing them here, yes?
One who works.
What does that mean, though? What was that? Probably not just blue-collar workers now. I think, look at the passage as a whole. This is Jesus talking, okay? He's saying, come to me, I'll give you rest, right? Take my yoke upon you, learn from me, right? Who are those who labor and are heavy laden, yes?
Those who are slaves.
Slaves would be included in here, but it's a little more spiritual than that, yes?
Those who are slaves to sin.
Those who are slaves to sin, right? Right. Jesus is not just talking to physical workers. Okay, he's talking to those who labor under the law. Okay, that's what it means to labor and be heavy laden. Jesus is calling to people who are aware of their own sin. That's key, because everyone's a slave to their sin from the start. Some people love that slavery and want to keep it going and find ways to exploit it. Other people, through various ways, become aware of their slavery, become aware that they're addicted to something, or that they're the choices that they made have had consequences that they can't overcome, right? Those people are who Jesus is calling to especially, because those people are repentant. Those people are aware of their sin, and they're aware that they are standing before a holy God who has every right to judge them for their sins. And they think that their only hope is to try and be holy enough for God to show them mercy. They're trying to work for their justification. They're trying to justify themselves by their own works. And the more they do this, the more hopeless they realize they are, because it's impossible to keep the law perfectly. Okay? As they go further and further and say, I'm going to do this better, I'm going to do this better, I'm going to do this better, it's just heaping more stuff they have to do upon their back. And it's all on them. They're taking all the responsibility, saying, I need to do this. So when Jesus offers these people rest, what does he mean by that? Yes? To become Christians, right? Let's flesh that out a bit more, yes? Right, taking their sins, yes. Yes?
Could be lifting the guilt that holds a lot of people back.
Right. Guilt, the heavy burden. If you've ever read Pilgrim's Progress, the first couple chapters, he's got the big burden on the back of his, or on his back, and then he gets to the cross, and the burden falls off. Yes, Graham?
We might be talking about when Jesus died, he took our sins with him.
Right.
The sins didn't come back up with him.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so he's offering to remove the burden of them trying to justify themselves by their own works. Not because God doesn't require works. Not because God doesn't require obedience and perfection. He does. But we've failed to do that. Jesus succeeded in doing that, right? He perfectly did it. And so he can take the burden from us. I've done it. Let me take it from you. Okay? So he's going to give them rest from the fear of judgment. Okay? When you're aware of your sin, immediately there is a fear of judgment because you recognize what you've done. Just like if you break the law and realize that you broke the law, like the civil law, right? You're going to fear being, arrested and put in jail. Okay? Because you're connecting your action to the punishment that follows it. Same thing goes with sin. But Jesus is taking that from us. He says, that fear doesn't need to belong to you anymore because I've already satisfied the punishment. I've already paid the debt. Okay? But this is not to say that they're not going to carry a burden or work at all, right? If you keep going, he says, take my yoke upon you. What is the yoke? Not the egg yolk. That's spelled differently anyway. Yes?
So oxen?
Goes on what?
On oxen.
Oh, on oxen. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's a little hard to describe, but yeah, it's essentially like a wooden bar that goes across usually 2 oxen. It could be more, and they're put together so they can plow a field, in straight lines. So he says, take my yoke. People use them too, right? You see like paintings of people carrying stuff on loads, and it's like a big wooden bar across their back, right? So he says, take my yoke upon you. So he said, I'm going to give you rest, but at the same time, you're going to take a yoke upon you. You're going to take a burden upon you. It's going to be my burden. Okay? So he says, work. Take this yoke upon you. But what's the difference? The difference is that now we work with and alongside Jesus. Right? The analogy of a yoke shows this because a yoke is typically places a burden upon 2 animals, right? So when Jesus says, take my yoke upon you, he's implying that he is on the other side of the yoke, right? That Jesus has this yoke, he has an open space here, and he says, you, take this side on you, okay? Now, Jesus carries the whole burden of the law's commands, so they're not going to crush us, right? That's why he's on this side of the yoke. But because of this, we're able to obey the commands out of love, right? And when we do this, we find that the commands they're not a huge burden to us, okay? That's why he says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Okay, elsewhere in I think it's 1 John, John says, his commandments are not burdensome. Okay? His commandments are not burdensome. One, because if you just read the 10 Commandments, they're not exactly the most intrusive laws ever written, right? I mean, how hard is it to not murder someone? How hard is it to not steal something? For some people, it's probably very hard. And obviously, there's a hard issue involved in it too. I understand that. But they're fairly simple, right? They're not like on Thursday at 3:54 p.m. each day, you have to do some funny dance, right? It's not like that. It's not some weird, super specific thing. Or when you pray, you have to face towards Jerusalem or something, right? They're fairly broad. They're fairly easy to understand. So that's one reason, but also because now we actually want to do them. Jesus has taken the painful burden from us, and now he's placing a yoke upon us, and a yoke is meant to actually accomplish something, right? It's not just a burden. It's something that's going to produce fruit, okay? When we do this, we find that because we aren't worried about every minor disobedience and whether it's going to damn us, we can obey freely. We can obey because we want to. And we see the benefits in our lives, right? Just go read the Proverbs and it talks about the blessings of obedience, right? Obedience does bring blessings. That's not prosperity gospel. That's not giving people a false hope. Generally speaking, in the normal course of life, you obey the commands of God, your life is generally better than if you don't, right? It's better if you don't murder people than if you do. You have a better life typically. You have a better life if you don't steal stuff. You have a better life if you don't cheat on your spouse. You have a better life if you don't use the Lord's name in vain flippantly, okay? But this all comes out of the gospel, The gospel's rest allows us to live out the law's commands. If you don't trust Christ, if you don't trust that he's on the other side of that yoke, bearing the much heavier burden, if you don't trust him, then you're not going to make any progress in this. You're not going to have any rest. Your life will be constant spiritual burnout. So we will end with this slide. We're going to get done fairly early this week. The Sabbath is a taste of eternal life. Does anyone want to read this last one? Any takers for the last one? Luke, go ahead.
For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God had commanded.
Okay, thank you. So this rest that's offered to us in the gospel, it finds its fulfillment in eternal life, okay, in the new creation. And the weekly Sabbath that we get on the Lord's Day, that's a taste of that eternal life, okay? Now, the author of Hebrews, what he's doing here is he's attempting to show the upgrade that believers receive in the old covenant compared to the new, the new covenant compared to the old covenant. And he quotes from Psalm 95 earlier, which references how God didn't allow the first generation of free Israelites to enter his rest. Now, what does he mean by his rest there? Yes? The promised land, right? He's saying they're not going to enter my rest. They're not going to enter the promised land. The promised land of Canaan was a symbol, or was a typological shadow, a foreshadowing of the eternal promised land, which is the new heavens and new earth. Okay? And that's why the author here brings up Joshua having not given Israel a lasting rest. Okay? The promised land, the land of Canaan, was never intended to be the end. It was never intended to be the end. We know that because after, as it says in Joshua, that they conquered all the lands that God had promised to Abraham. After they did that, time kept going on and things kept happening, right? It's not like that was the end of things and things just wrapped up, right? Things kept going because there was more to come, right? We need a new creation to give us a satisfying rest because sin is still present, death is still present, right? That's still a burden on us. How much like stress and work in your life is done to avoid death? Every meal you eat is to avoid death. All the sleep you have is to avoid death. Okay? Your hygiene is to avoid death. Your working for money is to avoid death. So much of your work is to avoid death. What about a world that doesn't have any death? That's a world of rest. Now, it doesn't mean you won't do anything, but you're not going to be working to avoid this impending end that's coming for you. Okay? And we aren't there yet. We aren't at that world yet. It's coming, but we aren't there. But God isn't going to let us starve until then, right? God's not forcing us to fast completely until Christ returns. Each week, he's giving us a sample of what is to come, okay? It's like those samples you get at the grocery store. Each one of those, that's what Sunday is. That's a sample of eternal life that God's giving you, a sample of heaven, okay? Because when we worship God with the church and we rest from our normal labors, right? Again, not every labor, but our normal labors, we're nourishing our souls. We're feeding our souls while also building anticipation for the next age, for the glorious new age that is to come.